Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered on SABC News, Channel 404. I'm your host, Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. Tonight we discuss an issue that has divided opinion and cast the spotlight on what looks like a potential lack of commitment to international relations obligations. Should South Africa arrest Russia's Vladimir Putin, president of the Russian Federation, if he lands on our shores at the BRICS summit in August? Does the ANC and our government have the backbone to take a position, like a commitment to international law regardless of who's affected, and follow through on it? And what is the impact of these seemingly contradictory positions on the International Criminal Court, and indeed our foreign policy in general? To further this conversation, let's welcome an esteemed panel: ANC NEC member Mr. Alvin Boertes, founder of the Institute for Security Studies, Dr. Jackie Cilliers, and on Zoom, Associate Professor of Public Law at UCT, Professor Kathleen Powell. Remember to engage in tonight's topic on Twitter using @Unfiltered SABC. Before we kick off, let's have a look at a clip of the announcement of the arrest warrant issued for Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Today, 17th of March 2023, the International Criminal Court has issued 2 warrants of arrest in the Ukraine situation. For Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation, and for Maria Lvova-Belova, Commissioner of the Russian President for Children's Rights, for the alleged war crimes of deportation of children from Ukrainian occupied territories into the Russian Federation. It is forbidden by international law for occupying powers to transfer civilians from the territory they live in to other territories. Children enjoy special protection under the Geneva Convention. The contents of the warrants are secret in order to protect victims. The ICC attaches great importance to the protection of victims, especially children. Nevertheless, the judges of the chamber dealing with this case decided to make the existence of the warrants public in the interest of justice and to prevent the commission of future crimes.
Welcome back. Mr. Boertes, you occupy a very unique position both within the ANC as part of its subcommittee, and you have insight into the state, of course, as Deputy Minister, and your experience there. Should South Africa arrest President Putin when he arrives on our shores in August?
Well, Sizwe, thank you very much for you and your listeners. Obviously, the first question supposed to have been what is, the foreign policy of the democratic state, and what is the optics of the ANC as it relates to its own international relations purview. I think my first submission, of course, is that since its establishment in 1912, the ANC has been known to subscribe to very high pedigree as it relates to international progressiveness, Pan-Africanism, and solidarity of the continent and international solidarity. So that is our value proposition to the people of South Africa. Of course, it's juxtaposed on the fact that our IR is considerate in relation to being just, being equitable, and being considerate. And that informs our perspective. Importantly, Sizwe, the 55th National Conference of the African National Congress convened in December 2022, that's just over 3 months back, have taken an unequivocal decision to rescind the mandate given to government to actually withdraw from the International Criminal Court.
Could I ask you on that, Mr. Boertes, because in 2015, 2016, around the al-Bashir situation, there was also some indication that the ANC was thinking about withdrawing and then it didn't withdraw. So can we be sure that this mandate is set in stone, or could this be another situation where the ambiguity persists?
Well, the African National Congress is not ambiguous. It's predictable. It has come from a national conference, which is the highest decision-making body Of course, the National Executive of the African National Congress is led by President Ramaphosa, would have to strategically look at what the different scenario settings is and obviously apply it, having a considerate view from the conference resolution on the rescinding our withdrawal from the ICC.
Could I then come back to my original question, which is, should we arrest President Putin if he arrives on our shores?
Well, the African National Congress, obviously at the strategic level, is for the deepening of global governance institutions and the deepening of multilateralism. It puts the ICC, at the pinnacle of what we need to do to ensure we bring about this equitable and just world order. Obviously, as a liberation movement, that is our strategic, ethos. At the level of being tactical in terms of implementation of legal obligations, that obviously is the purview of the democratic state. And like I've said, that Minister Pandor have been unequivocal. As a Minister of Terco, the Cabinet are considering the different scenario, options at its disposal. And I think tonight, obviously, it's more about the predictability and the certainty of the African National Congress in terms of its IR policy.
So as we said, we're actually not sure yet as a country what the decision will be one way or another. It's being discussed in cabinet, but we don't know yet. Is that the position? That
is correct, yeah.
Dr. Cilliers, far be it from me to not call someone doctor when they've earned a doctorate. How do you respond to South Africa's position? And can I put the question to you? Should we arrest President Putin if he arrives on our shores?
In terms of our legal obligations, there is no dispute. South Africa has to arrest him. Whether we can do that or will do that is an entirely different issue. I think South Africa will have to find a way of finessing this. You can't arrest the president of Russia without invoking all kinds of consequences. But the legal position is unequivocal. We have an obligation. It doesn't matter even if we decide now to step away from the ICC. It will not affect the legal position. And the legal position is, if he comes to South Africa, he has to be arrested. And I'm sure that if it was taken to the Constitutional Court, it will uphold that because the law is very clear.
And I'm going to come to Professor Powell because I'm sure she'll shed some light on the legal question. But I guess my question is also, in light of our legal obligations, but also the geopolitical situation, is it wise for us to arrest President Putin? So what's your view?
If there's any threat of arrest, he won't come. I think you can unequivocally say there's some reports. I think it's quite evident that we have to find a way of not disinviting him, but perhaps getting him to attend virtually. Maybe Lavrov will come. Maybe some of the meeting will be held elsewhere. But the risk of him flying here with 130 countries party to the ICC already presents him with a threat. And secondly, as I say, the South African legal position, the government can't get out of it. It's almost impossible. So we have to find a way of maintaining our obligations towards BRICS. We're a member of BRICS. Russia played a very important part in getting us to become a member of BRICS. There are all kinds of historical legacies and relationships, but South Africa also needs to look at what its interests are, because foreign policy is primarily about interests, not only about legacy and history. And the Putin issue is becoming a threat to our real interests, our commercial interests, our trading interests. So we have to deal with this very carefully, particularly our European and American trading partners, which are important to South Africa, are steadily starting to lose patience with the extent to which South Africa has very clearly not taken a neutral position in the war, but sided very clearly with Russia for historical and understandable reasons. But
do you think that's really true? Because many have said, look, we're caught between a rock and a hard place. We have to, like you say, negotiate these two different powers. And maybe the government has actually done the best it can to, tread this very difficult path.
I think South Africa could have played a little bit better. I think that the impression with the exercises and visits and stuff and the pronouncements are not that of a country that is trying to take an unaligned position, but a country that has taken a position. And as I say, the impression, we deal a lot with diplomats and the international community, is that patience is running out. And unfortunately, that presents South Africa with huge problems in terms of our trade and other relations.
Yeah, absolutely. And it looks like we already have an interesting conversation and debate on our hands. But Professor Powell, you obviously bring a wealth of legal expertise to this question. And there is a rule of law question here, isn't there? Because, I mean, let's assume President Putin does arrive, which I take Dr. Celia's point is probably unlikely. But if he does, we really don't have the wiggle room to decide which parts of the Constitution we like and which parts we don't like, do we?
No, we don't. It's a package deal. And so, I might add, is international law. So it's a bit disturbing that when you asked whether South Africa should arrest Putin, the answer came in terms of policy and strategy. I'm not saying that that doesn't matter. And I think Dr. Celia's answer showed which other factors we want to consider when we consider strategy and multilateralism and so on. But the first question is legal. Should we arrest him? Are we under a legal obligation to arrest him? And just as we can't decide which bits of the Constitution we want, we can't decide which bits of international law we want, particularly as the prohibition on the use of force is so completely entrenched in international law. It's the basis of our current international legal order. And I agree with Dr. Celias that South Africa has in fact not taken a neutral position, but a pro-Russia position on this front. And then secondly, because we're under a treaty obligation, because we're a state party to the International Criminal Court to carry out its arrest warrants, that's another obligation that we can't pick and choose. There is some legal gray area here. Let me put that out up front, that the ICC itself is not meant to put South Africa or other countries into the position it has, where it has a choice, where it has to choose between sticking to its treaty obligations under the Rome Statute and sticking to respecting the immunity of a visiting head of state. Because
can you talk us through that? Because that's quite interesting and a perspective I haven't heard much in the debate, where the ICC actually shouldn't put states parties in these invidious positions.
Yes, that's Article 98 of the Rome Statute, the statute that sets up the International Criminal Court. And what it says is that the ICC should not make a request of a state party that puts it into a position where it has to act contrary to its obligations to respect the state or diplomatic immunity of another party. Well, not of another party, because if you're a party to the Rome Statute, you've already agreed that there's no immunity, but of a third state. So there is easily an argument to be made that Russia is such a third state. Nonetheless, South Africa is under an obligation to execute that arrest warrant. But there is this problem in that Article 27 of the Rome Statute says no immunity, and Article 98 allows, attempts to stop the ICC from putting states in a conflict between their treaty obligations under the Rome Statute and their whatever obligations they might have to respect the immunity of non-state parties.
But you do,
by the way, argue that.
Sure, I was just saying you do. Sorry? And I think you alluded to this earlier, you do accept that for all the rule of law points, technically and legally in your favor, we could face a potential blowback here from a very powerful state that doesn't take kindly to those arresting its presidents, I assume.
Oh, I have no doubt that Russia's not going to be happy.
You can't do that.
I think that the blowback, however, is only going to be a strategic, and it'll affect diplomatic relations between the two states. It might affect trade. And there South Africa has to weigh up its trade relations with Russia as opposed to its trade relations with the rest of the world. And I'm not an expert on that.
Right,
but
right.
The legal consequences, if South Africa actually carries out its obligations under the Rome Statute, are pretty minimal. There's nothing Russia can do legally.
Right. No, absolutely.
It might flex its muscle elsewhere.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you for that perspective. Mr. Bottas, how do you respond to some of the disagreement in the discussion around we're placing policy over rule of law? What's your take on the conversation so far?
Well, it's very simple. We are non-aligned as one of our values as the ANC. And as early as 1961, when we became part of the non-aligned movement, one of the values enshrined in the NAM movement was the non-aligned posture, where we have said at all times developing countries of the South should be agile and should be very careful not to become beholden to one of the big powers as it relates to their contrast in their relationship is concerned. So we have been non-aligned. We have a strategic relationship with the Russian Federation. We have a valued relationship with Ukraine. In fact, anyone that wants to raise a matter of discontent in relation to our stance as it relates to the conflict in Ukraine have forgotten that your military army of the ANC Umkhonto weSizwe, one of the key bases was in Odessa in Ukraine. So we have a very valued relationship. Our non-aligned position as the ANC, as executed by the democratic state, speaks about the centrality of the peace diplomacy as opposed to the enhancement of the military complex. What we have seen, Sizwe, is there has been a reluctance to engage in the de-escalation debate on negotiations, on mediation. And what we have been seized with as the ANC is to canvass the government to substantively raise these matters with, in particular, members of the P5, those 5 permanent members of the Security Council. I can confide in you that issues has been raised by Minister Pando.
Have we had any success though with that? Because I think one opposing view is that yes, we say non-aligned, but at the same time we conduct joint naval exercises with Russia while it's at war, and that can create the impression that while we speak non-alignment, we practice alignment, or at least partiality.
Well, no, Sizwe. I think what the government are doing is to engage in what we call the servicing of its bilateral relations with individual states. We have a strategic relationship, for example, with the United States of America. In fact, the U.S. is the single largest FDI investor into the South African economy. So there's absolutely no disclaimer as it relates to our proximity with the U.S. from the side of government. The key issue is, and I think, the Minister of DIRCO have raised it, when there's a conflict, we are the proponents of de-escalation for peace diplomacy, and simultaneously, we continue to service our bilateral relationship, including with the Russian Federation, and we speak truth to power. We engage the leadership of the Russian Federation in terms of peace diplomacy. And what I can tell you, Sizwe, more than often, the opinion that are being canvassed as we are speaking now is for the centrality of the UN Secretary General Guterres to take a central role in regards to peace envoys. And that is what we are calling for from the side of the African National Congress.
No, absolutely. We have a fascinating discussion here which has just begun. We're going to continue the debate after the break. We're talking whether South Africa should withdraw from the ICC, even arrest President Putin if he arrives on our shores. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to Unfiltered. Tonight we're discussing South Africa and the ICC. Should we withdraw? Should we arrest President Putin if he arrives on our shores? We've had a conversation about the arrest of President Putin and looked at various perspectives on that, but there's a wider question here about the International Criminal Court and the obligations it places on states, but also perhaps the partiality of the court itself. There's a massive global debate going on about disproportionate targeting of African states. I'd like to just give you some context around that and present you with some information on the number of states parties to the Rome Statute, 33 African states, as you can see. And I think that's interesting because there are more African states than other states in the Rome Statute. So that needs to form part of our debate. You can see the Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, and you can just see a composition there of how many states from different regions are parties to the Rome Statute. And I think that opens us up to our conversation. And Dr. Cilliers, I'll start with you because we didn't get your take as the debate unfolded before we went to the break. But can we start on this ICC question? Because there is a very strong position at the moment, and goes back at least a decade, about the ICC's partiality towards Africa. Yeah. And it's one thing to respect international law, but then international law needs to apply to everyone. To what extent do you think there's a fairness in this critique of the ICC as it relates to South Africa at the moment?
I think some of that debate has mediated in the last few years. You're quite right. South Africa was a founding member of the ICC. We played a huge role in the establishment and joining, and then of course we became disaffected with it when it didn't suit us. When Jacob Zuma was president and we invited Bashir over and all of those kind of things. But with all its flaws, we are a party to the Rome Statute, together with 33 other African countries. And we did that despite concerns about the role of the P5 and all of things, because we state that we believe in the rule of law, a rules-based international system. So we can't decide now there are certain rules we want and certain rules we don't. When you are a member of the Rome Statute, you have to abide by everything you are signed to. So it's not for us now to pick and choose, unfortunately, and I have great sympathy for the difficult position that the South African government finds itself in. And I think, but the legal situation, I think, is very clear on the one side. On the other side, it's also clear that we can't arrest him from just a practical point of view. You'd be declaring war on Russia.
But I think sometimes we do understate the extent to which the ICC has focused almost exclusively in its warrants of arrest and its indictments, even its prosecutions, on African leaders. I think there was a time when it was only African leaders, and I think it's now something like 96% African leaders. So sure, there are a lot of African states that are party to the treaty, and sure, there are also just a lot of states in Africa. But it does seem a little suspicious that 96% of the ICC's activities focus on Africa when we know that there are massive war crimes happening around the world that have nothing to do with African leaders or African states.
So the starting point of this is the country that probably has been the most responsible for instability globally, the US, is not part of the ICC and withdrew after initially, dabbling in maybe supporting it and so on and so forth. But the problem is that you have one of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, which has so blatantly violated it. I think it's also to understand, I do long-term forecasting, I compare where the world goes. Africa has many states, and many of those states are at war. It's also the reason why most of the peacekeeping missions are in Africa. So the fact that the ICC focuses on Africa reflects the weakness of Africa internationally. It also reflects where the conflict burden and the poverty burden is globally. So yes, it reflects a power imbalance, but I say again, we joined. We are a member of it, and like every other African state, particularly one that has the kind of constitution that we have, very liberal, well-developed constitution, we have to abide by our own obligations. And we also have to abide and look after our relations with BRICS and just the practicalities around this.
Professor Powell, how do you reflect on this wider question of the ICC's legitimacy? Because, of course, that does matter when it comes to questions of law, the legitimacy of the ICC in the eyes of African leaders, in the eyes of African states. Do you think the ICC has dented its legitimacy by focusing so disproportionately on African leaders and African conflicts?
I think think that there are a couple of decisions that I would have taken issue with of the ICC not to investigate, for example, war crimes in Iraq, because the UK is a state party to the Rome Statute, and that was a place where the ICC could have perhaps seen fit to have a look, because there was a complaint laid there. That's the one I would take issue with. But for the rest, I think that Dr. Salia's point is very, very good. Remember that the jurisdiction of the ICC is over serious crimes. We're talking about genocide, crimes against humanity, aggression, and war crimes. Now, those happen in areas of conflict, mainly. And the point that Dr. Salias has just made is that there's a lot of conflict in Africa. So there's a lot of scope for investigation there. There's a lot of need for investigation there. The other thing that we need to remember that African states tend to conveniently forget is that in many cases, they themselves have referred matters for investigation for the ICC, actually asked the ICC to investigate and take over criminal prosecutions because they don't have the capacity. So I think that the legitimacy of the ICC might be dented in the eyes of some African observers. But if you check the surroundings and check the facts, you will see that it's actually not a fair criticism of the ICC, and it's actually simply doing its job, which is to seek out and respond to complaints about those serious crimes from areas of instability and conflict, and from areas where they have states parties.
Well, I suppose that some might say not only the UK, but in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where Palestine has been seen as a states party by the ICC, that the decision of the ICC to take 5 years, first preliminarily investigating and then sending the jurisdiction question back to the court, and then, not since 2015 actually taking a position, and then suddenly, when it comes to President Putin, at the speed of light, we have an arrest warrant. Isn't that another example? So Western allies seem to get all this time and all these jurisdictional benefits, but African states and non-Western allies seem to be bearing the brunt of the ICC's indictments and even prosecutorial decisions.
I would need to have a better statistical and in-depth knowledge of all of those decisions to answer. I am glad that the ICC is looking at Palestine. I am sorry it's taking so long. Palestine does count as a state party for purposes of the Rome Statute. And that is in itself actually a fairly progressive measure, because the very statehood of Palestine is contested. And the fact that the ICC has accepted the statehood of Palestine is itself a good start. But yes, you're right. I do wish it would move a bit faster. I can't comment because I just don't feel up to date on all of the decisions that they've made there.
Sure.
But perhaps another point to make, though, about the arrest warrant against Putin. It's not actually an arrest warrant for waging aggressive war. It's an arrest warrant for kidnapping children. It's an arrest warrant for deporting and relocating children, which is it's been billed as a war crime, it's being prosecuted as such, but it's also a genocidal act. And I don't think anybody's going to claim that that's okay. So I think, as much as I would take issue with the pace at which the ICC has worked in other areas and some of its decisions, where it does decide to act, I can't think we can decide, no, we're not going to go with this because we're not happy about what they did elsewhere. I don't think matters as serious as this can be handled with a sort of whataboutism response, much as the ICC might be subject to genuine and well-deserved critique.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting to hear the legal perspective as well on that. And I think Professor Powell shows us that there are some grey areas, as she says, in the legal question. Mr. Boertes, should we withdraw from the ICC? What's the latest thinking of the governing party on this question? You started earlier giving us a bit of a context, but take us into what the debates are right now if there's no decision. And Do you think we are going to withdraw? Because in some ways that would be the honorable thing to do if we do disagree with arresting Putin, to actually say, look, we disagree and we are going to withdraw, rather than playing a game figuratively where we say, well, we're part of this, but not when it doesn't suit us. But we really do believe in it, but not really. Where are we on the ICC?
No, I think it's very simple, Sizwe. I've told you the ANC is a predictable organization, and that is what South Africans also expect. That is what its allies expect from it. We think being part of the Rome Statute places additional obligation on the democratic state to execute one of the pillars of international relations of the ANC. And that speaks about the deepening of multilateralism and the transformation of global governance institutions. I think the professor is quite correct. We have been perturbed by the fact that since the ICC's establishment, it's almost now 20 years that it is in existence, there has been a reluctance to be agile as it relates, for example, the plight of the Cuban people. I think Professor have raised a very important point, that the ICC should be seized with crimes against humanity. That includes economic crimes as it relates to, for example, the lives of the Cuban people that are subjected to extraterritorial sanctions. It includes the plight of the Palestine child, the Palestine children, that on a day-to-day basis, are abandoned by the world order. It speaks about the plight of the people of Syria and Yemen. And moreover, let's not forget the plight of the people of Libya. If you can recall, there was a UN Security Council decision 1973 that imposed, for example, a no-fly zone in the airs of Libya. The result of that decision has been, as a consequence, what you have seen today. Increased instability in Libya. Increased instability, precisely. And South Africa supported. And the ANC have made a instruction note, of course, to a government that we should at all times remain non-aligned. We must allow and keep open the corridor of dialogue and communication, so that what has happened with Libya should never repeat itself. I think that is what we are saying. We can't have a situation where people are calling on the ANC to place government in an inevitable situation where it must choose a particular side. Our non-aligned position have allowed us to pivot the issues on peace diplomacy.
Well, I think one of the difficulties is just not knowing. And maybe there's a strategic ambiguity where, and that's also possible, because these are deeply strategic questions. But I think there is an uncertainty on the part of the public, at least. So Minister Mantashe, just this week, says he thinks we should withdraw from the ICC. The SACP, in which you're in an alliance with, has come out guns blazing saying withdraw tomorrow, basically. And so there are these overtures being made, and then on the other hand, we hear there are still discussions going on. So it's very hard as a citizen to discern what the governing party's position on the ICC actually is.
Yeah. No, I think our central topology, this is not a complicated matter. You go to the 55th National Conference decision on the ICC, where the ANC are clear, are unambiguous. That is where we stand. Of course, the national...
Unambiguous in favor or against?
Where there's a mandate given that the ANC should rescind the decision of 2017 that have mandated government to withdraw from the ICC. So that is where we stand. We are clear about that issues. Of course, there's a broader battle of ideas in the ideological struggle and discourse that are taking place, especially given the anxiety and this agility with which the ICC have issued this arrest warrant, and juxtapose that, contrast that towards all other crimes against humanity that gets committed in the global south, and particularly also in Africa. And I think leaders of the ANC has an important role to play to shape societal discourse. So I think the statements made by Comrade Gwede Mantashe is an opinion in the broader battle of ideas. The National Executive Committee of the ANC is the highest decision-making body between conferences. Of course, will be able to fortify its opinion, relating to all these matters. Obviously, the SACP is obligated as a vanguard of the working class to raise issues at a very sharp level.
When do you think the ANC will have a position on the ICC?
Well, the African National Congress. No, the African National Congress has a position. It's clear where it is based on our national conference.
Sorry, I mean on the ICC as it relates to the Putin question, because we hear the envoys being sent and the discussions are ongoing. When do you think the position will be finalized?
No, remember the ANC takes policy decisions on the architecture of global governance structures. That's what the African National Congress does. The cabinet under stewardship of President Ramaphosa then engage in its obligation in relation to those policy positions of the ANC. And cabinet have, I think the spokesperson of the presidency have indicated cabinet assists with that matter. So what we must allow is to allow the head of state and his cabinet the space to take very strategic decisions that's in the best interest of South Africa, but that is also in the best interest of shaping this global world order that the ANC are advocated for.
Dr. Cilliers?
Well, the legal situation is very clear, and that is that we have an obligation to arrest him. It's not a policy decision, it's simply a legal statement, literally of fact. That we can't do it is also true from a practical point of view, so we have to finesse this and play this. But, the policy confusion that we see from people like Minister Mantashe, whether it's on electricity, coal, or the ICC, is very well known. So that is no surprise. And I think the Russians are playing us, and they've done it very effectively.
Why do you say that?
So we're a member of BRICS. It's a very important club, sort of in contrast to the G7, another pole of, in the recreation, very necessary, of a new global order that provides space for the global south. Very, very important. But we, on every occasion that we've engaged with Russia, the Russians have been very adroit, whether it is the visit of their ships at night or as part of military exercises, conferences, events, to place South Africa in a very, very difficult position, levering us. And I think that we are trying to dance around this issue, but South Africa doesn't come out clearly on principle. And the principle is very simple. Russia invaded Ukraine. We can go on all kinds of stuff. It's a permanent member of the Security Council. It lies at the pinnacle of the rule of law of the UN Charter. And that country is in violation, in gross default of the UN Charter. That issue is black and white.
Are you clear on our ICC position as well? Do you
Yes.
feel like you know where we stand on the ICC?
Yes, I don't think South Africa will withdraw. And even if we were to withdraw, legally it makes no difference. It will not affect the obligation to arrest Putin, because the subsequent withdrawal makes will not affect that legal principle.
Until we find ourselves in this situation in another 3 years or 4 years.
Yeah, I commend, and I think many of us were really glad that the ANC decided to rescind the decision to withdraw from the ICC. I think very important. We need to invest in building a rules-based order that is fit for all of us, not only for the West, because one of the reasons why the ICC targets Africa and the global south is because the majority of its members and its weight and its origins come from the West. That needs to change, but that will take time. But it is happening. I mean, we see the world changing before our eyes today in so many respects. But when it comes to what Russia has done with Ukraine, it's such a clear violation by a P5 member of the Charter of the UN. You sort of can't argue that away.
Professor Powell, I think and please feel free to respond to anything that's happened in the conversation so far, but one other thing I wanted to add to this in terms of the legal question is also that if we undermine the Rome Statute, isn't that the only international criminal instrument that recognizes apartheid as a crime against humanity? So on the one hand, yes, we can thumb our nose at international imperialism, but actually recognizing apartheid as a crime against humanity is quite an important international norm that we want to hold on to. So we can't be too quick to throw the baby out with the bathwater here either, can we?
No, we can't. It's a good point. Of course, there was the General Assembly Declaration in 1974 on apartheid as a crime against humanity. But to actually have an institution that will prosecute for it criminally, that is not to be sneezed at. And I would suggest it's one of the things we want to consider when we consider whether to stay with the ICC project or withdraw. I'm glad that you said I can also respond to points that have been made.
By all means.
I think there's been a fair amount of irrelevant material thrown into the debate, and it does help to just clarify a couple of central points. First of all, to take issue with various injustices across the world, like the economic repression of Cuba, is misleading, because when we're looking at the ICC, what it can do is limited by which states are parties to it and what its own statute says. It doesn't define crimes against humanity as economic oppression. That's simply not one of the options under the Rome Statute. Now, the statute that South Africa signed up to has a particular definition of crimes against humanity. We can only start complaining when it's that definition that doesn't get applied in a state over which the ICC has jurisdiction. Now, the ICC has jurisdiction in this particular case where Putin's concerned because Ukraine has subjected itself to the jurisdiction of the ICC and the crimes that happened on Ukrainian territory. So we can't start being indignant that the ICC isn't solving all the problems of the world. We can get critical, and we do, when the ICC doesn't carry out its own mandate correctly. It seems to show favoritism there, but it skews the debate to pretend that the ICC is responsible for a whole lot of injustices that it really can do nothing about. Secondly, we do need to be careful to talk as though being non-aligned means not recognizing when one state has invaded another. I'm struck by Mr. Bush's expression, when there is a conflict, then we must respond diplomatically. As Dr. Cilliers pointed out, Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine didn't invade Russia. There are no Ukrainian troops in Russia. So Russia invaded Ukraine. To say that, okay, now we all want to talk about this and we don't want to blame anybody, is to suggest that Ukraine somehow has to earn the right to get Russia to leave. Now, it's a fundamental tenet of international law. It's what our whole global order relies on, that you cannot walk into another state. Admittedly, states sometimes do it. Admittedly, the response might not always be with as much outrage as there should be. But to suggest that the victim state has to somehow negotiate, has to do anything at all to get the aggressor state, that is in fact taking a side. It's taking the aggressor's side.
Professor Powell, sorry, we just lost you momentarily there. I think we did get the 2 points that you made, though. I'm going to come back to you after the break on the third point and ask Mr. Bottas to respond within the debate as well. But let's go to a break. We're discussing, should South Africa arrest President Putin if he arrives on our shores? Should we withdraw from the ICC or should we stay? We'll continue the conversation after this break. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing the International Criminal Court and South Africa. We know that President Putin is due to arrive in South Africa in August. Should we arrest him or shouldn't we? That's the debate we're exploring and delving into. Before we go back into our conversation, let me take some of your comments from social media and let's have a look at what's being said on Twitter. So Oh, Madita says, Pres Putin must come. A warrant will be served on him or the Russian embassy requesting him to present himself to Brooklyn Police Station. He will then proceed with his business at BRICS and fly out of the country. SAPS will rightfully claim not to have capacity to effect the arrest. Let's not talk about if he goes to a South African prison. Ayanda Sakile Zulu, not an ideal choice, but it's the safest in my opinion. Arresting him would serve our relationship with Russia. As one Russian official noted the other day, it would be a declaration of war. One last tweet from Moeketsi. But your guests, UCT Prof and Dr. Celias, are not discussing the fact that Russia is not a party to ICC's Rome Statute. They're saying only that SA has an obligation to arrest President Putin. Professor Powell, you were concluding your third point, and maybe if you could also consider that point about Russia not being a states party and explaining the jurisdiction nonetheless because of Ukraine being a states party. But I'll allow you to conclude that third point.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure where the internet cut out, but
we got most of your second point, yeah.
All right. The point I was making is that there cannot be an obligation to negotiate that somebody leave your territory. The whole of international law, the current global order, is based on the obligation not to enter another state's territory in the first place. If state A fails to honor that obligation, state B does not have an obligation to do anything to get state A to withdraw. So I think if you're claiming that you're being neutral and you just want to encourage diplomacy, you have already taken the side of the aggressor. Remember that in a value-based legal order, whether constitutional or international, we actually have a duty not to recognize unlawful acts. We cannot claim that we are going to treat this simply as a matter of fact. Once a rule has been breached, we have an obligation to recognize that it's been breached and to try to set it right. So that was the point I was trying to make when I think the internet cut out. On jurisdiction, yes, the jurisdiction of the ICC is over nationals of states parties. So Ukrainians, for example, could be prosecuted by the ICC, but also over crimes committed on the territory of states parties.
Right, so that's why even though Russia is not a member, because the crimes happened in Ukraine, the ICC has asserted its jurisdiction.
Correct.
And the Ukrainian parliament has taken a decision in that respect.
Right.
Although Ukraine is not a member of the ICC, there is a 2015 decision, I think, by the Ukrainian parliament, which effectively comes to the same effect.
Right, right. No, thanks for clearing up the jurisdictional point, because I think it's also an important one. Mr. Boertes, some challenges to some of the things you've said. Cuba doesn't really, we can't blame the ICC for not addressing Cuba, and some other questions that Prof. Powell has put. How do you respond?
Yeah, I think what we are seized with, obviously, from the side of the ANC is how to better transform global governance institutions that include the ICC. So in terms of the architecture of the ICC, you have the Assembly of State Parties, which South Africa are part of, which obviously convenes annually. You also have the Bureau of the Assembly. And part of our, instruction note to the Minister of Terco is to be seized with on the transformation aspect of the International Criminal Court. That is a key and critical issue if we want to deepen multilateralism. But for us to create a distance between ourselves and a very important structure, from the side of the ANC, like I've said, we have been critical, but we have equally recognized the centrality of the ICC. It's the same issue, Sizwe, that here you have the Russian Federation at the historical level for the African National Congress. It has been a dependable and a reliable ally in our struggle to bring about freedom In fact, the ICC has not pre-existed before 1994. So at no stage has the ICC done any proclamation as it relates to apartheid. But during those times, it was the then USSR that has been seized with the plight of the oppressed, with the ordinary people that was disenfranchised in South Africa.
But so did Ukraine, as you said.
Yes, and that's why what we have said is that there is a conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And our obligation as a peace-loving organization and as a peace-loving people is to immediately pivot the centrality of peace diplomacy premise on de-escalation. Because what we need cessation of hostilities, and we need immediate de-escalation of that conflict that must premise obviously on dialogue, mediation, and negotiations. I think we have been concerned from the side of the ANC, Sizwe, that the last time that the world has been seized with the issues on peace diplomacy as it relates to this conflict was still with the Istanbul process, especially track 2 of that process. I think we are calling on the government of President Ramaphosa to continue to, during even the process of the United Nations General Assembly, UNGA, to continue to pivot the issues of peace diplomacy. This is paramount. It must be done under stewardship of the UN Secretary General Guterres' offices. But what we need, it's not the enhancement of the military complex, but to fuel and to put energy into the issues of de-escalation and peace diplomacy.
The first issue of de-escalation is for Russia to withdraw. I mean, obviously, it's a no-brainer, and that is the essence of de-escalation. So I'd like to know if the ANC is prepared to request that key component of de-escalation occur.
No, that's a complete misunderstanding about de-escalation. De-escalation, the central variable of de-escalation is cessation of hostilities and there should be no conditions. Then the parties to the conflict under auspices of the UN Secretary General come together and engage on what is the requirements to further de-escalate the conflict. We have done that, though. If you can recall it, with the conflict as it relates to the TPLF and the Ethiopian federal government is concerned, when no one in the world could, provide that type of a stewardship, Africa have provided that, and we hosted that peace engagement. And I think that is what we are requiring.
No, we hear Dr. 30 seconds, just so that you can respond, and then I'm going to thank our guests for a very enlightening conversation.
No, I think it's important that the ANC that South Africa stays within the ICC, but I think it's also important, as Professor Powell indicated, that South Africa has taken a position on this, unfortunately, and it is, we are not looking after our interests. We consistently look at history and to pay back the legacies to the Cubans and the Russians instead of looking at what our interests are. And those interests are really follow trade.
Absolutely. Professor Powell, Dr. Cilliers, and Mr. Boetus, can I just thank all of you? I think this has been a question in our public debate, but it's really examined in such depth from so many different angles and through such eminent voices in our society. So thank you all very much for joining us tonight. I think we've learned that this is a legal question, but it's also a geopolitical question. It's not just about President Putin, but it's also about the International Criminal Court. And as a country like South Africa, we have hard decisions to make about sticking to legal principle versus hard geopolitical realities. I hope tonight's conversation has shed some light for you as you make up your mind. Thank you very much for joining me on Unfiltered, and see you on the next installment. Good evening.